Good morning, and welcome to your daily news briefing. It is Monday, June 2nd, 2026. I'm glad you're here, and we have a lot to get through today. Some of it heavy, some of it surprising, and a few stories toward the end that I think you'll actually want to stick around for. We're going to start this morning in the Democratic Republic of Congo, because there is a story unfolding there that demands your attention. It is a story about an Ebola outbreak, but more than that, it's a story about what happens when a deadly virus meets a remote town with almost nothing to fight it, in a world that has been painfully slow to respond. Let me set the scene. The New York Times reporter Declan Walsh, the paper's chief Africa correspondent, traveled to Mungwalu, a gold mining town of about 150,000 people in Ituri province, in northeastern Congo. This is the epicenter of the current outbreak, and what he found there was, by any measure, a crisis. The Ebola ward at the local hospital was, in his words, disturbingly unsecured. People were wandering in and out. Hardly anyone was wearing protective equipment. There were almost no testing kits, no protective suits, no goggles, no masks. At one point, a reporter from the Times walked into that ward and saw the body of a 21-year-old woman named Christiane Bahati, who had died 7 hours earlier, still lying there, still highly contagious, while relatives came and went carrying food and water to other patients because the hospital had nothing to give them. Now, let me give you a little context here, because not all Ebola outbreaks are the same. Most of us, when we hear the word Ebola, think of the large outbreaks we've seen in West Africa and Congo over the past few decades, outbreaks caused by what scientists call the Zaire strain. And importantly, there are now approved vaccines and treatments for that strain. But this outbreak is different. It's being caused by a strain called the Bundibugyo virus, named after the Ugandan district where it was first identified in 2007. Before this outbreak, Bundibugyo had caused only 2 small outbreaks in its entire history. There are no approved vaccines for it. There are no approved treatments. And its mortality rate can be as high as 50%. The Congolese Health Ministry declared this outbreak on May 15th. But here's the thing, and this is one of the most alarming details in Declan Walsh's reporting. The virus may have been spreading since as early as March. There's evidence, including testimony from the hospital director Dr. Richard Lokudu, that one of the outbreak's first victims may have been a young woman who died on April 6th after a miscarriage. The anesthesiologist who treated her died on May 9th. The surgical assistant died a day later, and Dr. Lokudu himself fell ill around the same time, though he survived. He believes a vaccine from a previous outbreak, for a different Ebola strain, may have given him some partial protection. So by the time the outbreak was officially declared, as of last Thursday, there were at least 1,077 suspected cases and 246 suspected deaths. More than 400 of those cases are in Mungwalu alone. It has already become the 3rd largest Ebola outbreak on record, and international aid organizations are warning that without urgent intervention, it could become the deadliest ever. One of the doctors working there, Dr. Alex Bogle, put it starkly. He looked at the lack of basic protective equipment in his hospital and asked, "This is the best we can do?" That question has been haunting Declan Walsh since he left. The international response, Walsh reports, is being outpaced by the virus. And the virus isn't just spreading because of the lack of equipment. There are deeply rooted social and cultural factors at play. The town of Mungwalu, as Walsh describes it, is a kind of perfect storm. It's a gold mining area, which means thousands of migrant workers are constantly flowing in and out from other provinces across borders, and then going home, potentially carrying the virus with them. It's also surrounded by rebel-held territory, and the region has a long history of ethnic violence and displacement, which means there's a constant movement of people who are frightened and on the move. And then there are the conspiracy theories. Walsh reports that he couldn't count the number of conspiracy theories circulating in the community, that health workers and foreign NGOs either brought the virus to the area or are using it to kill people. In one of the most dramatic moments of his reporting, an armed crowd of more than 100 men, some carrying machetes and sticks, attacked the hospital in an effort to retrieve the body of a popular Catholic preacher named Silvestre Adama, who had just died from confirmed Ebola. They wanted his body for a traditional funeral. The hospital director refused, because he knew that touching an Ebola victim's body, as traditional funerals require, would turn the funeral into a super-spreader event. Police and soldiers fired warning shots. The standoff lasted 5 hours. And in the chaos, more Ebola patients fled their hospital beds and ran back into the town. This brings us to one of the most important and difficult aspects of this story, the role of funeral practices in spreading the disease. In this community, saying goodbye to a loved one means physical contact with the body, and the body of an Ebola victim is extremely contagious. Walsh describes local Red Cross volunteers, people who were farmers and miners and traders just a week earlier, who signed up, got some hastily arranged training, put on protective gear, and started going into communities to disinfect bodies and convince people to allow safe burials. He called it, and I think this is the right word, inspiring. There is also a glimmer of hope at the end of Walsh's reporting. A 5-year-old boy named Emmanuel Cyril, who had been brought to the Ebola ward and had been bleeding from the nose, the kind of detail that makes you stop reading and take a breath, by Friday was sitting up in bed and asking for toys. The bleeding had stopped. He hoped to go home soon. But the larger picture remains grim. Scientists are racing to develop vaccines and treatments for the Bundibugyo virus. On Monday, 2 major nonprofit vaccine organizations, CEPI and Gavi, announced tens of millions of dollars in funding. CEPI is offering up to $61 million to prepare 3 candidate vaccines for clinical trials. One of those is being developed at the University of Oxford, using an adenovirus vector similar to the technology used in the AstraZeneca COVID vaccine. Researchers say they could potentially have doses ready for clinical trials in humans in 1 to 2 months. Another vaccine candidate is being developed by Moderna, using mRNA technology. And there's a third, using the VSV platform that was already tested against Bundibugyo in monkeys with 100% effectiveness back in 2014. On the treatment side, the World Health Organization has recommended that 2 monoclonal antibody drugs go into clinical trials, including one called MBP-134, which has already shown it can protect animals from multiple Ebola species. But experts are being clear. Getting any of these treatments to the point of actually being deployed in the field will take months. And as one doctor put it, the outbreak is likely to continue raging. There's one more dimension to this story that we need to talk about, and it is frankly uncomfortable. A piece in the Times from science reporter Apoorva Mandavili, published in the World newsletter by host Katrin Ben-Hold, lays it out plainly. The United States, which used to be the undisputed leader in responding to global disease outbreaks, coordinating responses, providing funding, supplying expertise, is largely absent from this one. The Trump administration withdrew the U.S. from the World Health Organization. It shut down USAID and ended the vast majority of foreign aid. It rejected a global framework that obligates countries to report outbreaks. And as a result, American officials were not among those investigating a separate hantavirus outbreak on a cruise ship earlier this year. And they only learned of the new Ebola outbreak 9 days after the WHO first received the signal and alerted other global health authorities. 9 days. In an outbreak context, that can be catastrophic. The WHO's World Health Assembly wrapped up last week in Geneva. Health officials from around the world left with urgent reminders of the need to prepare for the next pandemic. Absent from all of the discussions, the United States. That's the Ebola story, and I want to sit with it for just a moment before we move on, because it matters. Not because it's likely to spread across the world. Experts say the current outbreak will probably remain largely contained within Congo and its immediate neighbors, but because of what it tells us about how prepared or unprepared the world is the next time something like this does threaten to spread across borders. Viruses, as Apoorva Mandavili writes, don't respect borders. All right, let's move to Washington, where there is a significant political reversal to report on. President Trump is backing away from his plan to create a $1.8 billion fund to compensate people who claim they were victimized by unfair prosecution by the federal government under the Biden administration. Now, if you haven't been following this closely, here's the background. This fund, formerly called the Anti-Weaponization Fund, emerged out of a legal settlement in Trump's $10 billion lawsuit against the IRS, which he claimed leaked his tax returns during his first term. Rather than having the government pay Trump directly, which officials worried would look terrible, senior Justice Department officials came up with this fund, which would draw from something called the Judgment Fund, an unlimited pool of money Congress authorized for settling lawsuits against the federal government. Critics, including prominent Republicans on Capitol Hill, immediately said this was essentially a scheme to reward Trump's political allies with public money. And the opposition was swift, staunch, and unusually bipartisan. Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican of South Dakota, said his party was still trying to figure out a way forward. Democrats called it a slush fund and launched a coordinated campaign to kill it. A federal judge in Virginia put the fund on hold. And separately, The judge who had overseen Trump's original IRS lawsuit suddenly reopened the case, saying she wanted to investigate what she called grievous allegations that the settlement had been premised on deception. Now, two people familiar with the president's thinking told the Times that for days, Trump has been leaning towards scrapping the fund. The Justice Department signaled the retreat publicly by saying it would abide by the court's temporary order not to activate the fund until at least June 12, when a hearing is scheduled. Administration officials privately expressed relief that the judge's ruling gave them a way out of what most had come to see as a mess of the Trump team's own making. But, and this is important, Republicans are skeptical that the president has truly given up on this. Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana put it plainly, saying you're going to follow a court order doesn't tell me anything. You have to follow the court order. Democrats said they would keep pressing the issue regardless. And there is also the separate question of whether abandoning the fund would affect another part of the legal settlement, one that provides Trump, his family, and his businesses with significant immunity from audits. This story is still developing, and we'll keep watching it. Now, today is primary election day in 6 states, and the one to watch most closely is California. This is the first California governor's race in more than 2 decades where voters are choosing someone who is not already a national figure. Gavin Newsom is term limited, and the field is crowded. The 2 highest polling Democrats are Tom Steyer, the billionaire financier who has run hard to the left and has spent more than $200 million, more than any candidate in California gubernatorial history, and Xavier Becerra, the former state attorney general and health secretary under President Biden, who would be California's first Latino governor in the modern era if he wins. The dynamic is fascinating. Steyer is running as a progressive outsider who has never held elected office, campaigning on raising commercial property taxes and overhauling healthcare and energy. Becerra is running on his credentials: state legislator, congressional leadership role, attorney general, cabinet secretary. He likes to say he won't need training wheels in the governor's office. Other Democrats in the race include former Congresswoman Katie Porter and San Jose Mayor Matt Mahan, along with former Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Villaraigosa and State Schools Chief Tony Thurmond. On the Republican side, President Trump endorsed Steve Hilton, a former Fox News personality, in April, and that endorsement has given him a meaningful edge over the other leading Republican, Riverside County Sheriff Chad Bianco. Here's what makes California's primary system unusual. The top 2 vote-getters advance to the November runoff, regardless of party. So the fear among Democrats for months has been that so many Democratic candidates splitting the vote could theoretically allow 2 Republicans to advance in the nation's biggest blue state. That fear has subsided somewhat as Hilton has pulled ahead of Bianco. But Steyer, Becerra, and Hilton are all clustered closely in polls, making anything possible. Hilton was apparently so worried about the 2 Democrats scenario that he publicly asked Bianco to drop out of the race on Saturday. In Los Angeles, Mayor Karen Bass is fighting for her political life. She's facing a challenge from the left from City Council member Nithya Raman and a Trump-aligned challenge from Spencer Pratt. Yes, the Spencer Pratt from reality television, who lost his Pacific Palisades home in last year's fires and has made Bass and Democratic leadership's handling of those fires a centerpiece of his campaign. Recent polls show a tight 3-way race, with Bass holding a narrow lead and Raman and Pratt fighting for second place. California counts its votes slowly, so don't expect clarity on Tuesday night. But stay tuned. Moving now to the Middle East, where the negotiations over Iran are showing new signs of strain. President Trump told CNBC on Monday that the Iran talks are starting to get very boring, saying, "I don't care if they're over, honestly. I couldn't care less. If they're over, they're over." This is notable for a few reasons. For one, just hours before making those comments, Trump had posted on social media that negotiations were continuing at a rapid pace with Iran. For another, Trump himself back in March said there was nothing boring about this. When someone suggested he might get bored negotiating with Iran, he pushed back firmly. The conflict, it's worth remembering, has sent gasoline prices soaring, and Republicans are well aware of how unpopular the war with Iran is with their constituents. Meanwhile, on Monday, the U.S. military struck missile launch sites in Iran and boats trying to place mines, in what U.S. Central Command characterized as defensive strikes intended to protect American troops. This came hours after Iranian negotiators arrived in Qatar for peace talks. And separately, Israel appears to have backed off threats to strike Beirut after pressure from Trump, though Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israeli forces were pressing on harder against Hezbollah, saying, I said to press on the pedal even more. Let's turn to a story that is strange, sad, and genuinely puzzling. The case of the missing congressman. New Jersey Republican Representative Tom Keene Jr. has not been seen in public since early March. He cast his last vote in Congress on March 5th. Since then, his office has said only that he has a personal medical issue and is expected to make a full recovery. But he has not appeared in public. He has not voted. Two of his Republican colleagues said they had not been told anything about his whereabouts, and their texts went unanswered. His chief of staff told the Times, "There's no cameras where Tom is." Times reporters investigated extensively. They filed open records requests with local police, called more than a dozen of his campaign donors, visited his primary residence in Westfield, New Jersey multiple times, located his vacation home in Bay Head, and found advertising flyers stuffed in the door, tracked down his family's estate on Fisher's Island in New York, and called approximately 20 hospitals in New Jersey, New York, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. No one had any information. Keene did give a brief phone interview to a New Jersey political journalist on May 21st, confirming he would run for re-election and saying his doctors were confident he was on the road to a full recovery. He faces no opposition in today's primary, so his win is assured. But in November, he faces a well-funded Democratic opponent in what's considered one of the most competitive House races in the country. His continued absence remains, as of this morning, unexplained. Now to a story about trust. Specifically, about whether the Justice Department can still be trusted to tell the truth in court. The answer, according to an increasing number of federal judges, is not always. Federal judges across the country have been issuing scathing rulings in recent weeks, accusing Justice Department lawyers of withholding information from courts and making statements that turned out to be false or misleading. In Rhode Island, a judge called the government's account of negotiations with a hospital over patient health records misleading, if not utterly false, and said the Justice Department had proven unworthy of this trust at every point in this case. In Chicago, a judge found that government lawyers had improperly redacted grand jury transcripts to hide misconduct. In Tennessee, a judge expressed serious skepticism about a former prosecutor's claim that he alone had decided to bring charges against Kilmar Armando Abrego Garcia, the Salvadoran man who was wrongly deported, with emails showing that Justice Department leaders in Washington were closely involved and calling it a top priority. This matters because the federal courts have historically operated on an assumption called the presumption of regularity, the idea that government lawyers can be taken at their word because their reputation and the reputation of the entire executive branch is on the line every time they appear in court. When that trust erodes, the whole machinery of the legal system slows down. And law professors who have spent decades in the Justice Department are sounding serious alarms. The pattern of judges accusing department lawyers of dishonesty, one former official now teaching at Harvard Law School said, is such an extraordinarily awful look for the Justice Department. The department pushed back, calling any attack on the professionalism of its lawyers outrageous and unjustified. Let's talk about the oceans for a moment, or rather, about a decision to stop listening to them. The Trump administration is dismantling a $368 million deep ocean observation network that was put in place a decade ago to monitor coastal environments, marine ecosystems, and powerful ocean currents that affect the global climate. The National Science Foundation announced it will send ships in June to begin removing more than 900 deep-sea instruments anchored off Oregon, Washington State, Alaska, North Carolina, and a location between Greenland and Iceland known as the Irminger Sea. This network, called the Ocean Observatories Initiative, has been used to understand how the ocean absorbs greenhouse gases, how marine heat waves might affect fisheries, and to monitor the Atlantic Meridional Overturning Current, a global conveyor belt of water that some scientists worry may be weakening due to climate change. A collapse of that current could have severe weather effects around the world. The network costs $48 million a year to run. Congress had previously pushed back against the Trump administration's earlier attempts to cut its funding by 80%. This time, the administration simply moved ahead with decommissioning. Scientists who have spent years collecting data from these instruments say the loss will be irreplaceable. There's a lot of expertise that has the potential to be lost, one Boston College professor told the Times. Removing the instruments could take 15 months. Related to the theme of preventable harm, let's talk about vaccines, or the growing absence of them. Doctors around the country are reporting more cases of serious, sometimes life-threatening illnesses that vaccines have long kept at bay. Whooping cough, or pertussis, which saw more than 28,000 cases reported last year compared to around 7,000 in 2023. Rotavirus, which was largely swept away by vaccines introduced 20 years ago. Haemophilus influenza and Streptococcus pneumoniae, bacterial infections that can cause pneumonia, meningitis, and sepsis. Doctors are also seeing adults refusing tetanus shots after dog bites or lacerations, with some patients telling their doctors that pharmaceutical companies don't need their money, or that they're being paid per shot administered. The concern among physicians isn't just about the children whose parents have chosen not to vaccinate them. It's about the youngest babies, who are too young to be vaccinated yet, and who are now being exposed to diseases circulating more widely because overall vaccination rates have declined. One pediatric hospitalist described treating 4 to 6-week-old infants with whooping cough who seemed fine at times, but then stopped breathing after a coughing fit. This trend has been building for years, accelerated by distrust that grew during the COVID pandemic, and which Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has amplified. Measles re-emerged as an early warning sign. Now other vaccine-preventable diseases are following. One doctor in Miami said she has been telling the medical residents training under her that they may have to learn together how to treat illnesses she herself never encountered during her own training, because vaccines had eliminated them. Now let's shift to a spectacle that unfolded in Midtown Manhattan on Monday morning, which has become one of the most talked about moments in media this week. At CBS News, the long-running Sunday news program 60 Minutes is in turmoil. The show's veteran correspondent Scott Pelley appeared at a staff meeting that was intended to introduce the new executive producer, Nick Bilton, a tech journalist and filmmaker who was just appointed as part of a major shakeup. And he lit into Bilton and CBS News editor-in-chief Bari Weiss in extraordinary terms. Pelley called Bilton's qualifications slender and accused Weiss of murdering 60 Minutes. "She does not love this place," Pelley said, his voice shaking with anger according to a recording obtained by The Times. "She was brought in to kill it, and she's been doing exactly that." The tension has been building for months. Weiss is an opinion journalist who spent years as a prominent critic of legacy media institutions before being brought in by David Ellison, the tech scion who took control of Paramount in a merger to run CBS News. The firing of the show's previous executive producer, along with 2 of the show's correspondents, Sharon Alfonsi and Cecilia Vega, in what Pelley referred to as Black Thursday, has left staff furious. Bilton, for his part, held his ground, telling Pelley he wasn't there to be intimidated and promising that the show would remain the show. "The journalism is the journalism," he said. He also warned that broadcast television was an ice cube that is melting. Weiss was not at the meeting. A CBS executive said she had been prepared to come but was asked not to. After Bilton left the room, the 60 Minutes staff applauded Pelley. Let's go north of the border now, where something remarkable and potentially consequential is happening in Canada. The province of Alberta, often called the Texas of Canada, an oil-rich western province that has long chafed at its relationship with Ottawa, is heading toward a referendum this October that will ask citizens a question almost nobody expected to hear on an official ballot. Do you want to stay in Canada or hold a separate, binding referendum to secede? It is, in essence, a referendum on whether to hold a referendum. For most of Canada's history, Albertan separatism was a fringe movement, with polls showing no more than about 20% of residents supporting it. That number has now climbed above 30%. The movement has been fueled by a sense, widely held among Albertans, that the province is exploited by Eastern Canada, that its oil and gas industry was stifled by climate policies from the Trudeau government, and that Ottawa simply doesn't listen. In one of the more striking details of the Times' reporting, State Department officials met with Albertan separatist activists in Washington 3 times last year. The activists described one meeting in which a State Department official was senior enough to go directly to see Trump in the Oval Office afterward. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said in January that Alberta is a natural partner for the U.S. They have great resources, and Albertans are very independent people. Alberta's Premier Danielle Smith has been playing a complicated game, lowering the threshold required for a referendum petition, which empowered the separatists, while also working with Prime Minister Carney to win a new pipeline deal and other concessions that she says prove Ottawa can be a partner. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney called the referendum a dangerous bluff and compared it to Brexit. He knows better than most what economic disruption a secession vote can cause. He led the Bank of England during Brexit. Among ordinary Albertans, the picture is nuanced. Many who signed the petition to hold a referendum, including a 31-year-old pulp mill tradesman named Stephen Lovelace, aren't necessarily separatists. They want, as Lovelace put it, to scare Ottawa. From ancient politics to ancient archaeology now, a fascinating find in Laos. Archaeologists have been puzzling for nearly a century over thousands of massive stone urns scattered across north-central Laos, in a region known as the Plain of Jars. Local folklore held that ancient giants had carved them to brew rice wine. Scientists long suspected they were funerary urns. Now, a new study published in the journal Antiquity offers compelling evidence that the scientists were right, and then some. A team excavating one particular vessel, which they named Jar 1, found inside it the jumbled, disarticulated remains of at least 37 people, spanning infants to adults, arranged with careful intentionality, skulls stacked around the rim, longer bones laid across the edges to maximize space. The jar had apparently served as a communal tomb, used over a period of roughly 270 years, from the 9th to the 12th centuries. The researchers believe these communities practiced secondary burial. Bodies were first allowed to decompose elsewhere. Then the bones were gathered and permanently interred in these large stone vessels. Inside and around the jar, researchers found iron tools, earthenware, a copper-based bell, and glass beads that chemical analysis showed had traveled from as far as Mesopotamia and South India. The Plain of Jars, it turns out, was not an isolated backwater. It was a hub of global commerce, connected to China's Song dynasty and the pagan kingdom of what is now Myanmar. The region today is still heavily littered with unexploded bombs from the Vietnam War, which has complicated excavation efforts for decades. But this discovery, described by one archaeologist as the most concrete, irrefutable evidence yet of how these vessels actually functioned, opens as many questions as it answers about who these people were and what happened to them. Before we get to a few lighter stories, a quick note from the world of opinion. Yale law professor Natasha Sarin makes a pointed argument in the Times today about America's relationship with taxes. She calls the current moment the Oprah tax code. Tipped workers, you get a tax break. Teachers, you get a tax break. Overtime workers, you get a tax break. Her argument is that America is already a low-tax country compared to other developed economies, that this proliferation of exemptions makes the tax code more complex and the government less functional, and that the real problem isn't taxes. It's that Americans don't see enough value from what their taxes buy. Without taxes, she writes, society falls apart. As the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes once said, taxes are what we pay for civilized society. Now for our number of the day, and this one is genuinely delightful, 55. That is how many chicks a pair of critically endangered parakeets in New Zealand have produced in just 2 years. Trixie and Nacho, those are their names, and yes, they chose each other, are orange-fronted parakeets, also known as Kakariki karaka. There are only about 450 of them left in the world. The species was declared extinct twice, once in 1919 and again in 1965, only to be rediscovered both times in remote mountainous valleys. Trixie and Nacho live at the Isaac Conservation and Wildlife Trust in Christchurch, and together they've increased the population of their species by more than 10%. Other pairs in the breeding program typically produce between 10 and 15 chicks. Trixie and Nacho produced 33 chicks in this season alone. The wildlife manager at the trust says they keep a close eye on both birds to make sure the work isn't taking too much out of them. But, he says, they keep very busy. Many of their offspring have been released into the wild. A few more stories before we wrap up. In sports, Serena Williams will return to the tennis court next week in doubles competition at Queen's Club in London, the traditional warm-up tournament for Wimbledon. Williams is 44 years old, and this will be her first tournament in almost 4 years. And in the NFL, the Cleveland Browns have traded star pass rusher Myles Garrett to the Los Angeles Rams in a blockbuster deal that includes picks in the next 3 drafts. In culture, the Obama Presidential Center has opened on Chicago's South Side. The center's signature building is a blocky, 225-foot granite tower that former President Obama wanted to look like 4 upraised hands reaching to the sky. The Times' architecture critic Michael Kimmelman says he doesn't see it. I see a boulder in a park, he writes. But beyond the architectural debate, the center has real ambitions. 19.5 acres in Jackson Park, with ball fields, playgrounds, a teaching kitchen, a branch of the Chicago Public Library, recording studios, and meeting rooms, all free to the public. The center opens to all on June 19th. In lighter entertainment news, over 1,037 Marilyn Monroe fans gathered in Palm Springs last weekend to dress as the screen legend and celebrate what would have been her 100th birthday, setting a Guinness World Record in the process. They gathered beneath a giant, Forever Marilyn statue in downtown Palm Springs, each wearing a blonde wig and white dress. "When I think of Marilyn," said one attendee named Tracy Burwell, who wore a floral jumpsuit that had belonged to her mother in the 1960s, "I don't usually feel sadness. I always feel happy." And in a dispute that captured the imagination of many readers yesterday, a woman spent $7,300 on a United Airlines Polaris business class seat for a 14-hour flight from San Francisco to Beijing, only to have the seat button stop working shortly after takeoff. A flight attendant wrenched the seat into lie-flat position, where it got stuck with the seatbelt inaccessible. She was forced to lie flat, without a seatbelt, for nearly the entire 14-hour flight, even as the pilot advised passengers multiple times to buckle up for turbulence. When she complained, United initially offered a $150 voucher. After negotiating, she got a total of $650. The Times' travel columnist said, "That's not enough." But as things stand, airlines' contracts of carriage generally protect them in situations like these, because the fine print says that amenities are not guaranteed. It's a maddening corner of consumer law. On a more global cultural note, a dispute is brewing between Brazil and Mexico over a dog. Brazil's beloved caramelos, the caramel-colored street dogs that roam the country by the millions, have starred in a Netflix film, appeared in carnival floats, and nearly made it onto the currency, have been declared a Mexican breed by authorities in the state of Mexico. Brazilians are furious. "How can they say the caramelo is not Brazilian?" said one Rio resident. "It's the face of Brazil." A genetic study last year showed these dogs are a mix of nearly 300 breeds brought by Portuguese colonial settlers and subsequent waves of immigrants. Animal welfare advocates in Mexico argue that the caramel stray is just as common in their country due to a shared history and climate, and that the designation was aimed at reducing stigma against mixed-breed dogs. One Mexico-based advocate said, "It's Latin American." And finally, most of the artists booked to perform at the Great American State Fair, a summer concert series celebrating the nation's 250th birthday this year, organized by a Trump administration-linked group called Freedom 250, have dropped out. By Monday, most of the lineup had bailed. Late-night hosts had a field day. Jimmy Kimmel said the remaining lineup consists essentially of Trump himself and Vanilla Ice. "The only well-known artists who did not back out were Flo Rida and Vanilla Ice," Kimmel said, "who now need to find another way to make $80 that night." Jimmy Fallon added, "The only people confirmed to be there are Trump and Vanilla Ice. I'm pretty sure that's how a creamsicle is made." Jon Stewart had perhaps the most philosophical take. "See, everybody dropped out, but not Vanilla Ice. Vanilla Ice didn't drop out. He saw a problem, and he solved it." That is your morning briefing for Monday, June 2nd, 2026. It has been a morning heavy on Ebola and political reversals and missing congressmen, so I want to leave you with the image of Nacho and Trixie, two small orange-fronted parakeets in a sanctuary in Christchurch, going about their very busy work of saving their species one chick at a time. Sometimes the most important things happen quietly, in places most of us will never see. Thanks for starting your morning with us. We'll see you tomorrow.